everyone for joining us. We've just been talking. Any points that you'd like me to raise?
Just regarding that background sort of scenario, can we make up our own information that's not there? Can we assume our own information as long as we justify it with our actions?
Okay, so can we just explore that idea a little bit about what it would be that you would be making up or what it would be that you would be justifying?
Well, we just finished a thing for a professional educator where we were given a very brief scenario, and our group did an entire background, family history and of the child and all that sort of stuff, just to justify our actions that we took at the end. So we'd thought about everything we'd thought about it by the extra information we'd made up, and we justified the framework we used and the actions we took.
Okay, so to some extent, you've got a chunk of information available to you right now that talks a little bit about the community. So as we were just talking about with Barb, there's every reason that we would be able to, for instance, talk about the community. About a quarter of them are living in at or below the poverty level. So that might have implications for some of the support programs that may be offered. And we touched on and talked about last week in our discussions the sorts of things that one person was going to do to develop opportunities and enrichment activities for students. If you were to look at, for instance, if you were to look at the numeracy or literacy data, and you were to identify consistent patterns across years, and you were thinking about what you would do for the literacy, a literacy intervention, that's absolutely fine. I think what I'm guessing, and I have to think about this because I always like these questions that come up, I think that the question that you're asking is, what is it reasonable to surmise on the basis of the data? Have I captured that, Kathleen?
Yeah, that's it. Like to do with just say there was kids that had very low academic ability. Yep. Could one of our programs be to make sure they had access to that in-school apprenticeship programs as well as so they could do their regular subjects plus do like start training towards like a pre-apprenticeship?
Apprenticeship program might be a good idea. What lines of evidence would you draw on to identify that as something that could be a focus for you? So you've taken an interesting tack there. It's not necessarily one that I anticipated, but that's okay. Now let's look at the assessment. Okay, can you all see that screen? Oops, sorry.
Yep.
Okay, so the first point that I think you were addressing, I was interested that you went straight to the relative growth curves, and we'll go there in just a second. But let's look at this for a moment. There's probably quite a bit of information there that would enable you to identify and make a case for the sorts of enrichment programs that you're talking about. So if collectively we wanted to have a look at what that data is, what are the factors that you might think would predispose your cohort to benefiting from the sort of interactions that you're talking about, Kathleen?
The fact that at least a quarter of the school families come from below or at poverty line.
Yep.
With about a fifth remaining underemployed or unemployed.
Yep.
That all factors into it. Like a quarter of the population is a pretty big population, I would assume, of students that come from those low socioeconomic families.
Yes, I'd agree. Now let's think about that in terms of how you would go from a quarter low SES communities into wanting to undertake VCAL-like initiatives.
So what was the question again?
Okay, so the question I asked was deliberately vague so that you could interpret it however you would like. So let me be much more specific. So your rationale, your thinking, your reasoning has gone from, I'm going to focus in on a quarter of the families are living at or below the poverty line, and I'm going to focus on developing a VCAL-like program or a pre-apprenticeship-like program in the primary area. Now, can you help us by sharing with us the thinking that you put in to go from quarter in poverty or less into pre-apprenticeship-like programs? It's good. I'm just trying to provide some thinking and some frameworks around this so that others can think through the same sort of issues.
I know that it's not just a vague assumption that a lot of
suggest it was.
Yeah, a lot of underemployed or unemployed or impoverished people either have little or no education, or maybe there's been no one has been to university from their family yet. Maybe they get into trades, which means they're probably making more money than we ever will as teachers. But anyway. So it could be that they don't value education, or maybe they have a whole different value system, which means it could also be problems with attendance issues as well, which might make it hard for kids to achieve academically. At least if they're getting into something where the dad can see this is a solid occupation where the kid can make money and buy his own car and be self-sufficient, and the kid's happy because he doesn't have to learn calculus, well, then it's a win-win situation.
Yes, I'd agree. So you've got, so the first question that you asked related to, are you happy for us to make this up? And I was getting a little bit hesitant there for a second, but you're not actually making it up. What you're doing is making inferences from the data that you have in front of you, and you're looking at what would maximise the outcome for the students and perhaps your colleagues and teachers in order to personalise the learning for particular groups. So I think that's great. So now that we've filled in the stepping stones, if you like. Yep. I was going to ask, then you started talking. I don't know that I've asked for that specifically, other than to say, are they evenly distributed? And the answer seems to be there are slightly more in the primary than in the secondary, which sort of says something about retention. But I'll need to get that information for you.
I'd like that also, please, Noel.
Okay, so I'll post that tomorrow. So the Noel to-do list, that's if they'll give it to me. They're lovely people at the school. I'm sure they will. But I just put the codicil on this that I may or may not be able to get it. I'll certainly ask. So primary.
That's another thing too. Like if I did a teaching placement at a school, a very low socioeconomic school in Tasmania with a population of 200 high school students. They had like a program of $5,000 funding a year, right, which was like nothing. And it's all but based on how many kids attend that school. So you can't say, oh, yes, we'll do this, and this if you're working with like $5,000 or less a year, depending on how many kids are at that school.
Can I give you an example that we ran across recently as part of a research project we were working on? It's quite an interesting comparison. we were working with a school that was among the very lowest of SES in Australia, and we were working within the same group at the same time with representatives from one of the most affluent schools in Australia. So you're talking about maybe a $2,000 budget for science versus a $20 million budget for science. So it's that sort of variation. So yes, I'll seek to get that information for you, the split in numbers. I think they'd probably be happy for me to give it in a percent rather than absolute numbers, just for anonymity's sake.
Noel, in those numbers, we'd need to pick up, because a lot of even P-12s that I'm aware of get new students coming in at the secondary level.
Yes.
So we'd need to know if they were new students coming in or the same going right through.
Cut you off.
Okay.
Where is the graph that you're showing at the moment? Where is that on LMS?
Oh, you want to see the graph as well? I don't know, we might charge entry for this. Okay, so I've gone into the subject on the LMS.
Yeah.
And then I've gone across to the assessment tab.
Yep.
And then I've looked at assessment task 2. And then I've clicked on school data for your analysis.
Right, okay.
We got there eventually, Lauren.
Thank you so much.
Well, you want to improve the pink area, but I don't believe you can improve the pink if you haven't brought them up to state average on that left-hand and middle area, the green one's more. And there's still, I can't roll it because you're rolling it, but if you look at them, there's still a lot with wrong answers in those areas. So until you've got those more up, we probably can't improve the pink much.
So, Barb, the point that you make is really well taken. I guess the element that you're describing is, let's make sure that all of the students have the foundations necessary to improve on the right-hand side. So that being equal, you would then perhaps be differentiating or personalising the learning to some extent to lay the foundations for those students who would most benefit from it, and to provide enrichment or extra activities to have those students who are more capable achieve more on the right-hand side. So you're moving progressively the whole cohort in their capability to move to that right-hand side.
Yes.
So if you're looking at a specific intervention, you would be looking at, say in this case, I'm going to pick one at a column at random, sorry. And let's blow that one up.
Well, use that one. Oh.
Correct.
If you notice a large number.
Places, or whichever it is. The only reason I've picked on that one is because that was the middle of the screen and they were making errors in that area.
I suppose what I was looking at, when you scroll down, if you notice they give an answer and nearly everyone else gives the same different wrong answer, that maybe that's something that you should be, those concepts are easier to correct than where you've got a variety of answers.
Yep, I think that's a good point. So that enrichment activity.
So there's more A and B.
Yes. So
in that one in the middle, there's more A and Bs that are wrong as opposed to Ds. So it's really a matter of looking more at that concept and seeing why they've put A's, B's as opposed to the C.
Barb, now you're getting exactly the right sort of approach, thinking about, well, if they're getting this wrong, what is it that they're getting wrong? Is there a foundation in an earlier year level that they struggled with? Is it something that I taught that they struggled with? So automatically we've gone straight into defining and identifying areas of challenge, and we're starting to think about some of the things that we could do to solve those issues. Now, there's a whole bunch of people, I think, who haven't yet asked a question. Now, Kathleen, I know I haven't quite covered all of your material yet. Would you be happy if we just parked that for a little while and just broadly addressed any other questions that people had? Okay, so Chris, are you just hanging out there, happy to just listen and think and conceptualise at the moment?
Yeah, I am. I'm just...
That's the question, and then we'll check in with Laura.
Okay, so with regards to the Gutman diagram, I'm sort of having a look at... as I'm a maths science teacher, and I want to sort of, I guess, raise the school averages to something similar to the state average. I think that would be quite useful in my, I guess, area of expertise.
Yeah.
And in looking at the Gutman diagram, I know that a lot of this stuff is to do with maths. I sort of had a question which sort of Kathleen brought up, where I'm sort of struggling to I'm sort of struggling to, I guess, justify this area of, I guess, academic rigor in light of the population statistics, which suggests that kids may not be as engaged due to the poverty line, due to lack of resources and things, and lack of engagement with education, perhaps. I don't know. That's sort of running around my mind. How do I justify, bringing up the academic rigor in this numeracy area in light of those, I guess, statistics, and without knowing any more further information, I'm sort of struggling a little bit to sort of put two and two together.
Which is an interesting challenge for the numerate amongst us, who I probably don't fit in with. And you're saying 2 and 2 is not connecting for you. So can we just explore that just a little bit? Because I suspect there's other issues that are underlying what you're talking about at the moment.
Sure.
And you said that you wanted to, or you were finding it challenging to justify enhancing the academic rigour around some of these maths concepts. Have I understood that?
Yeah, I think you have. I think that it's difficult as a maths science teacher. It's that's your area that you're passionate about. That's your area that you've grown up with. But for kids who don't understand or engage with that area, and especially if, as Kathleen put, perhaps some of them might be more into trades, or some of them might be more into other sort of physical jobs or physical subjects, it may be difficult to, I guess, put on them that numeracy matters, and that I guess the relevancy of numeracy in their future career and their future pathway.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, and I'm just checking in, is that you feel as if the hook that you would use might be difficult to catch these students with. Have I sort of caught on to that, or am I way off track?
Yep. I would say that's a pretty good explanation of it. I guess in my mind, like, I look at the state versus the school averages, and I see that there are many questions where the school average is below and significantly below the state average.
Yep.
Some of them up to 50% below the state average. And so, it would be nice to focus on, some of those questions, so that, it would improve the school averages against the state average, which would, help with numeracy further down the track with other subjects and things like that. But I guess it was a sort of a fleeting thought, where, because it was brought up that kids may or may not be as engaged with that kind of academic rigor due to the, I mean, I'm purely just going off the population statistics, that I'm just like, oh, how do I actually justify that if, like, I guess I'm pushing a pretty, I feel like I'm pushing a pretty hard line in saying, let's boost the school average to the state average, putting it sort of bluntly. But to justify that in light of the population stats is sort of, yeah, like you said, not connecting for me. Yeah.
Okay, so let's see if we can connect it, and it'd be really helpful to get our colleagues' inputs into this discussion as well, is that every generation is going to be slightly smarter on average than the one that went before. Now, if that's the case, then isn't it about improving their performance over time? Isn't it about challenging them to do more with the natural intelligence and the natural IQ scores that they're going to be accumulating over time? So even though these children may come from disadvantaged backgrounds, isn't it our opportunity to maximise the quality of their learning now and push those boundaries in future so that the next generation of students are doing something harder than this current generation?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that I guess, how do I put it in words? I guess yeah, I would love to be able to say that to any school that I work in, whatever the place is, regardless of the resources, regardless of the, I guess, the types of students that are there. Can I do that in a Australian regional school with less resources than the affluent schools? With, I mean, I could write about the change in mentality that would need to occur and things like that. But there are, yeah, just a lot of things that could perhaps hinder such a statement in that type of school, I suppose.
Okay, so Kathleen, I'm coming back to you in just a sec. If we can just pick up on that last point that you made, is it okay, or would it be justified and justifiable to really work on enriching the academic background and the capacity to perform well in regional or very low SES schools? And one of the projects that my colleagues and I here in Bendigo have worked on is with, and I'm not able to say which school, but one of the schools in our local region had gone from the lowest of like schools in Victoria to the highest of like schools in Victoria, and their budget for their science program was certainly less than half of what we were talking about earlier. And the way in which the teachers achieved that growth was, in essence, putting in place a program of enrichment and foundation studies. They developed higher standards for the students, and they got the students working and guiding and mentoring each other. So it was about improving the pedagogy, to some extent improving the curriculum, and improving the social interactions among students. And so they went from lowest of like schools to highest of like schools. And the principal, bless them, they're such a wonderful role model. When I publicly acknowledged that particular achievement, the principal said, yeah, but I want to go from the lowest of the next group up one step. So the point that I'm making is I don't think you need to be overly concerned about whether it's appropriate in any SES circumstance to be targeting particular growth. I think the real opportunity is, how do you get maximum growth for any student? Now, in your case, Chris, that may be that one of the measures that you would use would be percentage correct against the state average, but you may be more interested in other elements like students feel that they are more engaged and more likely to attend school because of the challenging and supportive environment that you put in place. So one of the great things about all of this is that education, as you're describing it, is an opportunity to level the playing field somewhat, so that people can be financially, socially, and intellectually mobile within the population. Now, Kath, have I answered your question, Chris?
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. Actually, that's quite, I guess, inspirational to that it can be done, and that it is up to the change leader, I suppose. So thanks for explaining some of that.
Can I pick up on that before I come back? Several of our colleagues have suggested in what area should I be thinking about myself as a leader? And the example I gave in our last conversation talked about two recent graduates. They were La Trobe graduates who ended up leading a literacy program. Now, the exact amount of improvement that they got, I think, was in the order of 12 or 13% in terms of literacy scores. Now, what was interesting about their intervention was that the way in which they analysed the data and the way in which they used their gut feel about how they would make the improvement. And interestingly, they didn't really focus very much on literacy. They spent more time focusing on reading out loud. And that, as a social activity, helped the students construct knowledge. So there are 3 takeaway points from that one. One, you can lead from anywhere, because these recent graduates said, hey, we've got to do something about this. Here's an idea. Here's what we've tried in our classroom. Would there be other people who might be able to make use of that strategy, or would you like to work with us to implement in your class? And the third bit is that they unwittingly were the exception that proved the rule. They didn't pay attention to where they were in the organisation in terms of a hierarchy, and instead they said, this needs to be done. I'm looking around and no one else is doing it. How can I do it? And then they laid down pretty much a step-by-step plan about how they'd go about it. Now, I'm not suggesting that you do this as I nod my head. What I am suggesting is that you can lead from anywhere. You should take it as your personal mission, if you so want to, Chris, to focus in on improving to or beyond the state average through making learning engaging and fun for kids who are unlikely to go there. So that might be part of your intervention.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point that you make there. So thanks for that.
No problem. Now, Kathleen, thank you for waiting extraordinarily patiently there. What can I answer for you?
Did you give us stats on if there's any kids with learning disabilities at the school?
I don't believe I did. Just let me go back and have a quick look. No, I haven't. Can I add that to my list of information to get?
Yep. And also whether or not the school has the funding to give every learning disabled child a teacher's aide as required. because that will affect the teacher's job.
That old chestnut.
Whether they can differentiate successfully.
I think one of the one of the challenging circumstances in terms of funding, that school I was telling you about, that went from bottom of like schools to top of like schools. I was talking to the principal there, and they made it very clear that there's a degree of bracket creep, so that students who might have received funding for a teacher's aide in order to address learning challenges, a student like that, say 2 or 3 years ago, might have got a teacher's aide then, and pretty much exactly the same student now might not get that. And so the principal was saying one of the challenges and one of the opportunities was to take the resources that you had and cross-subsidise those students who really needed help. So there was, to some extent, even though there were resources allocated for those who experience challenge, the actual dollar value that they spent or invested in those children was more than they would receive from the government.
So when you say cross-subsidise, does that mean take money out of buying books from the library in order to get the kid a teacher's aide?
I can't speak specifically to how the principal did that, but to some extent it's a question of if we have $5,000 from a Lamington drive that we've run with the P&C, how are we going to invest that? So it was a question not only of how am I going to cross-subsidise, but in what ways can I raise additional income in order to support the programs that we're looking at.
And by supporting those individual children with a teacher's aide, you're actually supporting the other students in the class so that they can get more of the attention from the classroom teacher.
That's exactly right, Lily. And one of the elements that you've just described there is a really good funding slogan for a Lamington Drive. One of my colleagues once said to me, he was a principal and probably one of the best I've ever run across, and we were talking about, well, we'd need so much money for this and so much money for that, and this is where we'd like to take the school, because we were working university with school partnership. And he said, so how much do we need? And I can't remember the figure. I think it was about $38,000 or thereabouts. And this particular principal, looked thoughtfully into the distance and said, how many Lamingtons do you reckon that is? And one of the things that I really liked about that person was that they were very entrepreneurial in the way in which they went about garnering resources. If the resources that they had were insufficient for whatever reason, they would seek to build a coalition of interested staff and then seek to raise the money either internally through one of the more inventive ones was rehousing the local basketball team onto school property, for which the school was then paid rent on the courts. And the basketball team was thrilled because they could give to a worthy cause. And the school was thrilled because they had some more money to spend on teachers' aides, books, computers, the whole gamut. So the reason I mention this is because to some extent, this is some of the aspects of leadership that you might be wanting to think about. So some colleagues at a local school, for instance, they managed to buy a piece of software that would allow students in a reading recovery program to experience age-appropriate and context-appropriate text. So if you had a child in, say, year 9 who had a reading age of grade 4, which is not unheard of in some cases, what this piece of software would do is not give the child a text that said, "See Spot run." It was more about, "See Darth Vader pick up his lightsaber." So it's age and context specific, but targeted at improving the capabilities of the student where they are. In this case, it was about a grade 4 reading level. And the reason that I mentioned that is because part of their goal was to raise the money for that piece of software from the community and from within the school, and they developed a really interesting and innovative way that they went about doing that. They ended up getting most of the teachers in that area on side. So that was part of their program. They recognised that, yes, they wanted this software. Yes, it would address an issue. Yes, they had to figure out a way to get people on board with it. Yes, they had to figure out how to raise money for it. And they did all of those things and did it very well. So the reason that they were so successful, I think, is because they mapped out what they needed to do and how they needed to do it. But Lily, I'm taking your point 100%. You've already outlined why investing either public or money that you'd raised would really benefit all of the children in the class, because that individual student who might be experiencing challenge would benefit from the one-on-one care that was given. So, Kathleen, did we answer your question?
Yep.
Disabilities. So the answer is, I'm not sure, and I'll seek to find out, and I'll post that tomorrow.
Couple. I'm looking at the NAPLAN data, and I managed to get into the My School Smart program to look at it.
Yep.
But I realised that those questions in the red area were all band 8 to 10 questions.
Yes.
And I think, if I understand correctly, that is someone who is exceptionally above the minimum standard.
Yes.
But we want all our children to be above the minimum standard. You don't want them to be at the minimum. So I wasn't sure if these results are still good or they're still quite average.
In terms of, say, in the Gutman diagram?
In terms of needing improvement.
I suppose this gets back to a fairly fundamental question. And in the same way that we were talking before, Chris, about how do you focus in on an individual, irrespective of where they live, and work to deliver the best outcomes you possibly can. And so I guess, Lily, to some extent, the answer might be, for you personally, how do I provide learning that is sufficiently personalised as opposed to differentiated, that everyone will achieve the same or better than average relative growth. So we're coming back to relative growth in a sec, Kathleen. But the point that I'm making is, if if you're in band 8 to 10, then how do you stretch that student so that they're going to continue to achieve very high relative growth? Equally, if a student is in band 4 to 5, how do you stretch them, support them, scaffold them, and stretch them to be the best that they can be? So Chris was interested before in terms of the rural and regional schools. I can say that in many of the schools of which I'm aware, teachers may experience up to a 10-point grade spread in reading levels, numeracy, literacy, whatever topic it is, but you'll get quite a spread. And so some of the really lovely work that's been done with those groups is very much in personalised learning. What people have done is said, well, here's the learning outcome that you might want to, that you need to achieve. Pick how you are going to get there. So to some extent, it's plan your own adventure. And what was really interesting was the way in which the children in, say, band 4-5 in that class, right up to band 8-9, were each pushing themselves to achieve relative to their starting capabilities. So the question I'd be asking is, how can you push everyone to grow from where they are?
Yes, I certainly believe that everyone should always be improving, not staying the same just because you're good enough. I then brings me to the next question, which is, if I was targeting a program at improving the students, or say the numeracy of the school, based on year 9's NAPLAN results, do I target that program to that year group or the year groups below who may have different areas that they need improvement in?
What would be two options you could consider?
Either of those.
Yes.
The option I actually am considering is looking at the NAPLAN data, and also the fact that 29% of staff are teaching outside their area of primary expertise, and perhaps considering that the staff are not equipped with adequate numeracy skills to teach.
Yep.
So looking at more of a professional development resource to equip staff with skills to teach numeracy in their specific subject areas.
So that's the contextualisation that you were discussing last time around.
Yes, I've just been thinking about that more.
Yep. Sounds like a plan. So the other option might be? There's always 2 or 3 options. So what we're talking about at the moment is ensuring professional development of staff so that they're equipped to work within a specific area and to teach subjects across, to teach particular elements within their own disciplinary subjects. And then there might be something about how you might engage with particular students at a year level. That might be before the one that you're targeting. So that would require teamwork between the different years.
I'm not sure how it works at this school, but I know my school teachers aren't restricted to certain year groups.
Yep.
At some schools, you're a teacher for year 7 and 8, or you're a teacher for year 9 and 10, or 11 and 12. But at the schools where I've worked, teachers are divided by their disciplines rather than year groups. So is it okay if I work on that idea?
Okay, I think that's fine. the thing I like about that is it doesn't focus on the student's year of manufacture in terms of grouping them.
Yes.
And so you could conceivably streamline the way in which the students would learn in the classroom based on their skill set, and conceivably jump them between classes within disciplines, which is the ultimate in personalising.
Yes, but probably the least practical in timetabling.
Yeah, there is always the timetabling issue, but let's not write it off just yet. So yes, I think you could certainly do the specialisation according to discipline areas. If you were going to go down that pathway, then the question that I would raise, which I think is probably more important, well, equally important, is how do you support, how would you support a group of teachers working within discipline areas rather than year levels, if that wasn't the current operation?
As in me, as a teacher down at the bottom rung, how would I support all the other teachers in the other discipline levels?
No, what I mean is, if, for example, your gig is to teach Year 9 English, how would you, how might you think about leading people to the conception that it doesn't really matter whether it's Year 9 English, the discipline area is more important in Years 7, 9 and 10, and how would you get people thinking about those 4 years instead of only 1 year?
Through creative advertising.
I knew it was going to be advertising and creating some really nice catchphrase amongst everything else. So that's the sort of broader focus that you might like to take on. Now, I saw someone had their hand up earlier, as in the electronic hand. Who was that? No one?
Lauren left, and she left a goodbye message.
Great. Okay, so now we've got some more time. So what would people most, I know what you want, Kathleen, what would people most like to do?
I just have another question. Do they have any gifted students at that school?
The proportion I'm aware of is...
look at the NAPLAN results and see how many students were very, very, very high achievers. You could make a conclusion on.
The element that I'd probably divine in what everyone is talking about at the moment is that there's a very strong focus on the analysis phase. And that's wonderful, because you're going to be leading people from here or from this place to this other place, and you'll have a data-informed purpose for doing so. But the critical element, particularly of this subject, is how are you going to undertake the leadership role that will move people from one place to another. So if, for instance, your major focus is on relative growth, probably the thing that I would look at is to say, if I was trying to set a goal, I want to improve the relative growth 1% per student per year. Doesn't sound like much, does it? But it's compound interest. So 1% this year and then 1% on that again over and above. Over time it adds up, and pretty soon you're up to 15 or 20% by the time they leave school. So I would be looking, if I was after a relative growth goal, maybe personally I'd look at 1%, 2%, 3% and be thinking about, well, what would I need to do to achieve that? It's a question of you setting a goal. It's less important about what that goal is than the fact that you've set a goal and then you're seeking to measure your performance against it.
Following on from that, you mentioned last week that it's less about the tiny details of what our actual project is. It's more about the leadership process.
Yes.
So I'm finding myself getting very nervous about what crazy idea am I going to come up with to improve the learning. But while there's an element that is important, it's more important about what strategies I outline that I'm using. Is that right?
I'd be very happy with that outcome.
Okay. So
I'm not trying to constrain you either way.
Yeah. But it's not that it's just directing your focus and what the learning objective is, which is to figure out how to implement our leadership strategies.
Yes.
Okay.
So the purpose behind this assessment task is focusing largely on how do I create, in essence, a blueprint in the broadest possible sense of how I'm going to implement this idea that I have. So tell me what the idea is. And so from last week, for instance, Lily, you were talking about how would you connect elements of your curriculum in proportions across multiple discipline areas. And so you might want to talk a little bit about that. Then you might want to talk about, well, how would you go about making that component of the curriculum something that everyone did? And so who would you work with? How would you go about it? What are the things you'd need to consider? What are some of the obstacles you might want to overcome? How might you do that using your leadership philosophy?
I was going to say, now you mentioned the leadership philosophy.
Yep.
For that 5% where you want us to revisit or improve and rewrite our leadership philosophy.
Yep.
Does that mean you want us to copy and paste our leadership philosophy at the end of our assignment and show where we've made that changes?
Yes, that probably I'm not sure if I mentioned this. I thought I had. Track changes works really well for most people to demonstrate how they've changed things. You know, those ones where you make the little bubbles out to the side. Now, I just want to clarify so that people don't feel that they have to change their leadership philosophy. So I would be happy if people could, for instance, say to me, no, leadership philosophy, it works perfectly. I anticipated these would be the challenges. The way in which I've shaped my leadership philosophy is working really nicely in these circumstances. Here's how I think it would play out. Here's why I think my leadership philosophy would work. So then I'm going to give you, so I'd be quite happy if you detailed around that sort of answer. So I'm going to go to the complete other end of the spectrum as well, just to show you that there's possibility, and say to you, no, my leadership philosophy absolutely wouldn't work. It didn't survive its first contact with my planning. And so these are the things that I would need to add in, think about, conceptualize. And by doing this, I would achieve these outcomes which are really important to my plan. So on the one hand, you've got people saying, no, this is great, working really well. To the other, yep, now having thought about it some more, I've got to make some changes, and here's why and here's how. And you can earn 100% of 5% by doing either. Make sense?
Yep.
Cool. Now, so everyone's focusing not only on the data analysis, but how you would lead from where to where. That would be an important element. Just emphasising that, okay? Now, Kathleen, if we can pick up on some of the points that you've raised. And is it okay if I share some of the email conversations that we've had in the past about your experiences down south?
Not a problem. But before we start, that graph you've got up that everyone can see.
Yep.
Can I just ask, what is the difference between the colours in the arrows and the colours on the graph? Because there's no legend. See, there's colours explained with the arrows, but there's colours aren't explained on the graph how it relates to the arrows on that graph.
Oh, okay. You mean these arrows here?
Yep. How do they relate to the colours directly above?
Oh, okay. So that's probably my fault for using those yellow colours. All I was trying to do in lining those up was show you that the 2011 cohort up here in Year 7 numeracy means translates to the same group of students in Year 9 2 years later. So that group there corresponds with that group there. The 2012 cohort, when they were tested in Year 7, correspond with the 2014 cohort down here.
Okay, I get that.
Or if it was okay if I shared some of your Tasmanian experiences, was because Kathleen is one of those wonderful teachers that we all want to have working in our schools, particularly if we're working with very low SES students. And Kathleen had written to me previously talking about tough schools. Is that right, Kathleen?
Yes, that's right. I was worried about attending Rugby High because in a very dangerous housing commission area. And yeah, when I attended, I only had 14 kids per class because the rest of them just didn't even bother turning up.
Yeah.
And some of them are on part-time educational plans to try to keep them in the school system.
Yep.
But some were like, could only survive maybe 5 minutes before having to be relocated.
And so do you think that particular cohort might have similarities to the cohort at Hogwarts?
Yeah, quite possibly, though. I'd say 75% of the kids in the classes I taught were from low socioeconomic, living at or below the poverty line. And a lot of them had parents in jail or family members in jail. Some of them showed me pictures of their mums with black eyes, all that sort of thing.
And this is why there's a particular skill set and a particular approach that teachers who really work well in tough schools and tough kids are able to excel. But the reason I asked the question is because if we recognise that this assignment is meant to be a potential blueprint that you can take to implement a plan in your own school and in your own space, then some of the interventions that you've described to me and you've described to a colleague of ours, Charlie Cote, who's an expert in working with tough kids, might some of those strategies be implementable in this space?
I'd say definitely. I was teaching forensic science at the school in English, but the biggest impact I had, I think, was forensic science, because I set up murder mysteries in the classroom for the kids to solve. I went berserk with red paint. I had blood spatter up the walls of the lab, and I created this like dead body with a wig on a soccer ball and clothes, and I had to solve whether it was murder or self-defense using forensic evidence. And we took DNA out of strawberries and we printed and like mashed up the strawberries, pretended it was getting loved it. But I also bribed them with tickets for most improved effort in science for the kids who had not wanted to be there and didn't think they'd enjoy it, but stuck it out and worked consistently and improved, even if it was just beginning with very low literacy and numeracy levels. They actually tried, and they were good. They were good because I said it was one year 8 against another year 8 class, and the class that worked the best would get a big box of favourite chocolates at the end of the unit. So they had one class versus another class, and it was on. They could relate to that.
So one of the reasons I was hoping you'd share that story is because I think that addresses to some extent, Chris, the point that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's, I feel like my eyes have been opened almost.
So that's a good thing. So what I would be saying, Kathleen, is that if based on your analysis of Hogwarts per se, you were to say, and this is at a really simple level, a quarter of the families are in poverty or below. Many of them are quite distantly located from school. Many of them would need assistance in resourcing for their education. So that's painting a particular picture. I think you could reasonably justify an intervention program along the lines that you're talking about that would directly address lower than desirable performances or lower class performances compared to state average, and what and how your forensic initiatives would make a real difference in class. So I'm thrilled if you say something like that. Then what I would be saying, because you've justified at each point, you're thinking in how you need to, how and why you would choose a particular area to implement a strategy with. And then I would be turning it around and saying, okay, so how can I normalise the CSI blood-splattered, bloodied strawberries that we're going to collect evidence from in order to catch the killer? And so then I would be asking questions, so how might you engage colleagues? You know, would it be a show and tell? Look, come and give me feedback on what I'm doing here. And they go, wow, that's fabulous. And then they might say, well, I wonder how I could do something like that in my class. And just say, you know, picking a topic, any topic, they were a maths teacher. Then you could ask the question, well, you know, look, I noticed that they're not so good on proportions. How might we work together on that? And so once you've got a coalition of people who are really interested in working with you, then you can progress from there.
Another thing I did too is originally I did a whole unit thinking that all kids like computer and ICT. Well, rugby had none. They had a few computers in a science lab, but all teachers tried the book at the same time. But when I talked to the kids, they didn't want that approach. They wanted a hands-on practical approach where they could touch, see and feel everything. A lot of them are really into drama, so I did murder mystery role play where they'd all have parts. Some were suspects, some were witnesses, some were police detectives, some were like forensic experts. And I got a lot of input from the kids themselves about what they would be excited about, like the method they preferred to learn with, and that really helped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what you're saying to me is, knowing in a fairly rudimentary way, knowing something about the cohort, knowing something about their relative performance against the state level, and knowing something about what areas they might want to improve in, I think you could justify very easily a strategy that would focus on hands-on, experiential, case-based learning.
Yeah.
Which is a really long and fancy way of saying what you're doing. And so then I would be thinking about, so if I'm going to do that, how do I get other people on side so that this becomes the norm in the school?
Yeah. I had teachers coming in and take photographs of my crime scene. And one of them set up a video recorder at the back of the room. Yeah.
So I think if you want to go back there for a job, you shouldn't have too much trouble.
Well, I hope so.
The fact that you've established a good relationship with the school is probably going to set you in good stead. And I know that each of you will bring something unique to the placements that you undertake, and it'll be on that basis that colleagues will say, yeah, I really want Chris or Barb or Kathleen or Lily or whoever, because they're really good at doing X. And so it's about that applying the element of uniqueness that you can bring, and creativity and innovation that you can bring to the classroom, that will, to some extent, influence the roles and the leadership opportunities that you'll be able to make happen. So for me, the reason I set this particular task is so that you've got a conception of how you would look at the data, how you would identify an area in which you might proceed. If anyone questioned, you could reasonably say, well, this is the sort of thing that I'm trying to address. So, Chris, it might be, how do I improve to state average? Barb, it might be for you, how do I enhance the attendance? And so on. But you would be able to say, well, this is what we're trying to deal with, this is what we're trying to work on. And so with that information in mind, then you can start plotting strategies on CSI or astrophysics or whatever it is that you're trying to target. We wanted the split between primary and secondary. We wanted a sense of how many, if any, students had been identified with a learning disability, and how many of those had teachers' aides working with them based on funding. What I would be delighted for you to be able to do is to be able to identify in what area you want to have the children improve. Give me a rationale or some sort of explanation about how you've come to that conclusion, and then talk to me about how you would work with others and lead yourself in order to achieve that that growth or that improvement in student outcome.
No, thanks.
No, I'm all good. Thanks, Noel.
No worries. So, again, next week, would that be helpful?
Yep.
I'll be there.